All right, Valerie. So, for listeners who have never heard or had the honor of hearing your testimony, would you just start by telling listeners your story and the story of your parents, Jim and Elizabeth?
Sure. So my parents, Jim and Elizabeth, Jim Elliot and Elizabeth Howard, met each other at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, 1947. My mother was graduating in 1948. He was graduating 49. They started studying Greek together because they were both Greek majors. Because my father initiated that, and my mother was shocked that he would want to study with her because she was an insecure but very brilliant young woman.
Yeah.
And so they began to study, and they began to realize towards April that they were falling in love. But my father had been known on campus as one who would tell people not to date because the most important thing on campus was to study and to glorify God. So he said we shouldn't even be working for the Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science degree. We should be working for the approved unto God. He called it the AUG degree. And that's what we should focus on. So that was one reason it was surprising, but also because my mother just didn't think anybody would ever be attracted to her. She had thought she would be a single missionary. He had also thought that, but he didn't tell her that until right before her graduation. They took a very long walk, and they had been to them praying hard and struggling with this new affection they had for each other, because my father confessed to her that he loved her. But he said, I think God has called me to the single missionary life, which she also had thought for herself. But then it was a shock that he told her that he loved her, because he didn't follow with what she was hoping for, but not expecting really, because she knew he was very single-minded about going to the mission field. But she didn't know when he told her that he loved her, that he would also say, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to marry you, because I think God has called me to the single life. So that was a heavy bit of news for her. She had been taught by her father, who had 4 sons, that a man should never tell a woman that he loves her unless he's ready to ask her to marry him. So that was the principle she had lived by and certainly believed in. So then my father throws off all those categories that she had in her mind, and they sit for a long time in silence as the shadow of a cross from a cross on a tombstone fell between them in front of them. The moon rose at nighttime, and they pondered the fact that they both needed to die to their feelings if they were going to follow Christ. So then my mother suggested that through the summer they would not write to each other. They would pray and simply seek God for what he meant in the way that he had brought them together, and they seemed to be so much on the same spiritual and intellectual plane. So they agreed to be quiet through the summer. She went to New Jersey. He went to Oregon, which is where they both grew up, where their homes were. And they did pray. But in September of 1948, and this was the year my mother had graduated, he started writing to her. That was 15 weeks of quiet. And they began a very amazing correspondence where my mother refused to ever say to him, I love you, because she felt that he had no claim on her and that she should not until they were both sure that God was going to bring them together in marriage. So 5 years of correspondence. They only saw each other 5 times. 2 of those times were a little longer. The other 3 were only 2 to 3 days. Each time they saw each other, they were more and more impressed with their complete unified thinking and their hearts for the Lord. So they both prayed for each other through those 5 years that the Lord would show them each what they were supposed to do, where they were supposed to go on the mission field. My mother had really thought for several years through high school that she was going to go to India, because she'd been tremendously influenced by Amy Carmichael, missionary in India for 50 years. And then after she got out of college, she went to Plymouth Bible Institute, which is in Alberta, Canada, for a year of study there, and then she was asked to teach Greek there. So this correspondence was very much about what the Lord was teaching them in the reading of the Word, and my mother's sometimes desperate desire to hear when he would be able to ask her to marry him, but also a very serious desire that the Lord would show him on his own where he was supposed to go and what he was supposed to do. So eventually, after she thought maybe Africa, after India, she thought maybe Africa, then she thought South Pacific Islands. Eventually, the Lord led them both to Ecuador within 2 months of each other. In Ecuador, they had 6 months of being together every day. They lived in separate Spanish Ecuadorian homes so that they could learn Spanish. They were going to a Spanish class together. They took hikes and walks around Quito, Ecuador, which is a beautiful spot, and they were more in love. But during that time, my father said to her, it might be, I don't know when God is going to show me whether I'm allowed to marry you, but it might be another 5 years. And he had been told when he was in college that the Amazon tropical climate is a very, very difficult thing to live in, whether you're a man or a woman, but especially for a woman, because the previous missionary who had been among the Quechua Indians who spoke at Wheaton College and met my father said that his wife had not been able to handle the climate. So he just assumed that most women would not be able to. So that's why my father thought he should have a single life on the mission field. And he had been called especially to primitive Indians, and he had heard about the Auca Indians, who are now called the Waodani, when he was in college, and he had said several times in his journal, send me to the Aucas, and I want to be able to sing over the Aucas, meaning I want to be able to see them come to Christ and praise you. And he had this position among Quechua Indians who had this same doctor missionary who had told him at Wheaton that women couldn't live in the tropics. So they continued their correspondence, though after 6 months of being together, they were sent to separate places. Again, they were praying all the time, where do you want me, Lord? And my mother was sent to the western jungles of Ecuador, which it's the west of the Andes, and my father was sent to the eastern. So all those details may be too much for everybody, but
no, this is so good. This is perfect.
They carried on the correspondence until my father was getting more and more desperate to be with my mother. Finally, after being from August of 1952 until January of 1953, they were separate, as I said. He realizes in December of 1953, he's got to go and ask her to marry him, because from her letters, she's also in the tropics, and he can tell that she's very strong. Her constitution was amazing. And because she had hiked these mountains, 12,000, 10,000 foot mountains with him in Quito, she never got sick. She was always strong. So he realized, well, number one, she probably can handle the tropics. And number two, I need a wife to be able to minister to the women among the Quechuas. So he was with another single missionary among the Quechua Indians for that year, 1952 to 53. But in January, he finally gets the opportunity to go to Quito, and he tells my mother to come to Quito on January 31st. So you can imagine the trip and the travel was long and difficult, but it was very eager for both of them,
I'm sure.
And so that's when my father asked her to marry him. But then again, he couldn't tell her when they would be able to, depending on what this other single missionary's view of what he was supposed to do was going to happen. My father was not sure he should leave him, or he should go get married, bring a wife to the field, and have Pete Fleming, who was also killed with him. And that's the next part of the story. And so Pete had been strongly advised by my father up in the States, when they knew each other in Washington and Oregon, to give up his engagement to his wife, to the future wife. Her name was Olive, and he did. He actually gave up his engagement, which was very, very hard for, of course, Olive and her family, who loved Pete very much. So here my father's struggling with his own love for my mother, had told Pete to give up his engagement to Olive. Now he's realizing, I really do need a wife. So all that went into these 5 years, and especially this year before he asked her to marry him. So they got engaged, and then, of course, travel between Quechua land to Quito, you had to get on a missionary aviation fellowship plane to get out of the little jungle town called Shandia, where my father lived, get to Chalmette, which is where the headquarters of MAF was, and then get a plane out from Chalmette to Quito. And weather and timing of when the MAF plane was being used were all factors. So anyway,
Sure.
He prays and prays and prays, and finally in about July in his, and of course, letters are going back and forth very, very quickly. And sometimes they could talk to each other on shortwave radio, which was very exciting. But my mother's having a difficult but challenging and good time among the Indians she's working with, as she's working on writing down a language that had never been written down. And when he asks her to marry him, he says, "You have to learn Quechua before we get married." So, of course, she has that new adventure ahead of her, but she's very good at languages. She'd already learned Greek, of course, and then Spanish in Quito. Now she's learning a language called Chasiqui, which is, I wouldn't be able to tell you how that's spelled, but anyway, it was among the Colorado Indians. And so they continue writing, and in July of 1953, he says in his journal, "It seems to me there needs to be some kind of a catastrophe before I will know when I'm supposed to marry Betts." He called her Betts. And so within 3 weeks after he wrote that, because of the Amazon rains, the rainy season and the dry season, it rains in the dry season, but in the rainy season, it rains tremendously more. Because of the Amazon rains, what Pete and he had built to prepare this mission station for another couple. Sorry, I have to.
No worries.
They've been building a chapel, a house, a school, and a storage building for who they think it will be coming to that station, Ed and Mary Lou McCulley. And Ed McCulley had been a very good friend of my father's at Wheaton. So 2 different men my father had drawn to Ecuador to say, we need to be missionaries to primitive Indians, and this particular Indian tribe, the Aucas, now the Waodani, are the ones we need to be focused on. So the rains come, and every single building that my father and Pete had built for almost a year in July of 53 gets washed away with the river flowing, river rising higher up to the plateau where they were. And the plateau was because that's where the plane could land, and the Quechua Indians had prepared this airstrip for this plane to land, and weekly it would bring mail and food supplies for Pete and my father. So then he realizes that's the catastrophe he had thought. I know I need to marry Elisabeth or Betts as soon as I can. Well, fortunately, between May and July, my mother had found a couple, or my father had also helped to find this couple who lived among another group of Quechua Indians. And they had a new baby. And so she decided and asked them if she could come and help them, and she could learn Quechua. Well, it happened to be only a 6-hour walk from where my father was in the jungle.
Wow.
So during July up till October, they get to see each other about once a month, because they walk to see each other 6 hours. Did I say 6 miles? It was 6 hours. Yeah. So having walked on, climbed those mountain peaks, they both had this endurance and, of course, this desire to see each other. So they had some very happy times. And finally, the opening for the right weather, the right plane trip, everything came together so that they could get married in October in Quito. So they get up to Quito, I don't know, October 5th or so, and they get married October 8th by a justice of the peace. And my father planned a wonderful 3-week honeymoon. They had not, of course, taken a vacation during their married year, and they went to Panama. And at their wedding ceremony, which was very, very simple, they both did have their best clothes on, but my father, who was not for the frills and the fanciness of regular weddings, and my mother, of course, so eager to marry him, accepted that. She was not too much a she wasn't at all frilly type person. So Ed and Mary Lou McCulley joined them in being witnesses for the wedding, and Dr. Tidmarsh and his wife, who had been the man that told my father first about the Aucas. So they were living in Quito at that time. And so it finally all came together. And they actually chose my father's birthday, October 8th. They were supremely, completely happy and joyful that the Lord had finally brought them together. My father realized that he needed a wife there in the jungle among the Quechuas. And from then on, they had 27 months of pure bliss and hard work. They worked first in another little village where the McCulleys, they thought were going to come. Actually, originally, it was for Shande. They were preparing the mission station. But now the mission station had to be all rebuilt. So they worked in another little village among Quechuas called Puyupungu, and they lived in a tent for 6 months, their first 6 months of their marriage. And the tent was very leaky, but they had to have lots of laughs and joy, because even though it was leaky, they were absolutely happy together. And the verse that they chose for their wedding day was, "Behold, this is our God. We have waited for him." Of course, it's not in my brain exactly what the reference is, but
we'll find it. We'll find it and put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And then I was born February of 1955, excuse me. Then 10 months later, my father, Pete Fleming, Ed McCulley, Nate Saint, the pilot of the MAF plane, and Roger Udarian, who was another missionary among another tribe of Indians, all were able to go to a beach that was near this little settlement of Aucas, Waodani. And these Aucas were known as killers. They were hostile to anybody who came into their territory. But Nate and these guys had started talking and planning and praying for how they were going to have a friendly contact with these Indians, so that the Indians would know they were not hostile, that they were not going to threaten their livelihood. And so Nate would take one of each of these men, usually for the 15 weeks leading up to this time when they were going to land on this little beach that Nate found near enough to the Auca territory, so that they could welcome the Aucas if they came to visit them on the beach. And on each of those 15 flights, they would drop a gift in a bucket that Nate Saint devised, hanging down from the plane as this plane circled over this little tiny village. And listen, it's only 40 people in this little village, only 10. The rest were wives and children. Many men had been killed off because the Aucas were known as killers. So even in their own tribe, they were called the fastest shrinking tribe in the world eventually, when anthropologists began to study them, because of this huge news that happened in 1956. So for 15 weeks, they dropped gifts. The Aucas began to return gifts in the bucket as the plane flew around in the circle and pulled up the bucket. So they gave a roasted monkey's paw. They gave a pet parrot, a live pet parrot. They gave a crown that they made out of macaw feathers. These Indians were absolutely Stone Age primitive. They knew nothing about the outside world. They thought this plane eventually, as my mother and I got to go and live with them, they thought this plane was a yellow, huge bumblebee. They called it the wood bee, Wood.
Wow.
So they thought that it came out, these gifts in this bucket came out of the stomach of the wood bee. Yeah. And they happily began to receive these gifts. The first couple of drops of the bucket were completely understandable for them. But then they began to see that these men whoever was on the passenger side would shout out 2 Auca phrases that my father had learned from another Auca woman who had fled the tribe several years before. Mm. And he found her when he's working among the Quichuas. And she, of course, knew her native language. So she taught my father 2 phrases. 1, "We want to come see you." Mm. 2, "We want to be your friends," in Auca. So when they flew over the little village, they had a megaphone. They would fly low enough that the passenger, whichever man Nate Saint had picked up, would say this phrase to them through the megaphone.
If you've ever taken your earrings off at the end of the day with that big sigh of relief, you need to hear about Comfy earrings. Comfy earrings are flat back, hypoallergenic earrings designed for 24/7 wear. No poking, no irritation, just beautiful, lightweight earrings that stay comfortable whether you're sleeping, traveling, working out, or running from one project to the next. They're perfect for women with sensitive ears, and they come in so many gorgeous everyday styles. Check them out at comfyearrings.com or through the link in the description. Refresh your jewelry box with earrings you'll never want to take off. Trust me, your ears will thank you. Now back to the show. Looking for non-toxic, high-quality soap made by a company you can trust? Let me introduce you to Indigo Sundries, a Christian, family-owned small business that's been handcrafting soap for over 20 years. Every bar is made the old-fashioned way and free from seed oils, parabens, phthalates, sulfates, and all the other things your skin just doesn't need. Just clean, skin-loving ingredients that actually leave you feeling moisturized and refreshed. Whether you love a good fragrance, prefer essential oils, or need a simple unscented bar, Indigo Sundries has something for everyone, plus liquid soaps, room sprays, and beard products too. Get free shipping on orders over $50, and don't forget to use code Rebecca10 for 10% off at checkout. Treat your skin to the good stuff at indigosundries.com.
and they'd drop these gifts. So they were just very practical gifts, even a t-shirt,
Sure.
even though the Aucas didn't wear any clothing at all. They dropped a t-shirt at one point. They dropped knives. The Aucas didn't have knives of their own. They dropped metal pots, anything that they thought they could use. So then they arrived on this little beach that Nate called Palm Beach. And my father prefabricated a tree house to have 4 of them sleep in for 4-hour periods, as they would have somebody on the beach taking watch. How do you say it?
Yeah.
Keeping watch, because there are dangerous animals like jaguars in the Amazon jungle, and there are also boa constrictors. But they also had decided, after many times when they talked together, these 5 men, we better take one gun. There were 2 guys that had been in the Army, Roger and Nate. The other 3, I guess Ed McCully had spent a little bit of time, but not fighting in World War II. But the other 2, my father and Pete Fleming, were conscientious objectors. So they had lots of discussion about whether they should take a gun at all.
Sure.
But for self-defense, the 2 Army guys won out with, well, we're not going to kill the Aucas. They all agreed, of course, that they would not kill anybody. They had prayed and prayed and prayed for these Aucas, and they, of course, wanted this friendly contact. So my father built this tree house, and 4 of them could sleep for 4 hours. Then they'd change watch. And they kept safe for 2 nights. In fact, they were safe for the 4 days that they were there until the very last day. But 3 Aucas came out of the jungle on the 2nd or 3rd day that they were there. And they were friendly. There were 2 women and 1 man. And of course, the white men all greeted them happily, but they really didn't know any other phrases to talk to them. So they did a lot of gesturing, and they gave them supper. They gave them hamburgers and lemonade for supper. And the Aucas, of course, had never had beef, and they never had lemonade or white bread. So that was a happy time, as the men tried to gesture and ask them what words were for certain things, for a certain kind of insect, what was the word. And they just had a really happy time of about 4 hours. And the young man, by gesturing, asked for a flight in the plane. So Nate took him up, and they flew over his little village. And he actually started to open the door to climb out, when Nate, of course, pulled him in and said, no, we can't do that. And the Aucas came out from under their huts and waved, and they saw who this young man the white men called George.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw him waving. And so it was a very happy afternoon. And in the evening, the 3 left. And then 2 days later, Nate Saint was flying over the jungle and getting more supplies from his station at Chalmetta. And so that morning he flew over the Auca village, and he radioed to his wife. They're not coming out from under their huts. It looks completely empty. Hopefully they're coming to see us on the beach, which he had figured was a 2 or 3 hour walk for the Aucas. Mm-hmm. So he said, I will call you at 4:30. And 4:30 came, and they were very prompt at talking to each other on the radio at least twice a day. And 4:30 came, and no call came from the men. Marge Saint, who was the wife of Nate, waited for 3 hours, kept on trying to call on the shortwave radio. And finally at 7:30, let the other wives know, and they were all in different stations. Yeah. So we let the other 4 know that something had gone wrong. They hoped for the next 3 days. They were praying and hoping that the men would be found. The Ecuadorian Army and the U.S. Air Force flew over the area where the men had been. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until Wednesday that, when a helicopter was flown over, that they found there were 4 bodies in the water with spears in them, and they could only see the 4 bodies. Later, it was discovered that the 5th body had come loose from the way they had killed them. The Aucas had come in the afternoon and ambushed them, 10 men with spears, and they all had several spears. So several spears were thrown at each of the men, and then they pinned them to the ground underneath the river. And that's a ceremony of burying the bodies right by the river. And the women, of course, as I said, they had hoped they had been held hostage, but by Wednesday, when the helicopter went over and they saw the bodies, they figured at least all 4 were killed. And Mary Lou was hoping that her husband was held hostage. Sure. But on 2 days after the bodies were found, the 5th body was found, Ed McCully's body, just a little further down the river. Wow. I was only 10 months old, so I don't remember at all what my father was like, but through my mother's writings and his writings, because he kept this amazing journal,
Yeah.
I have always been awed by my father and his dedication to the Lord and to being obedient. And he said something that has been quoted over and over and over by lots of missionary candidates, as well as people speaking to missionaries to call people to the mission field. And this quote is, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." He's paraphrasing Jesus, saying that if you give up your life, you will gain it. But if you try to save your life, you will lose it. So that quote has been used with thousands of people to challenge them to be willing to die for their faith. And though my father and the other 4 men were called martyrs, technically they were not martyrs, because they were not standing there trying to say, we will live for Jesus or die for Jesus, because the Aucas didn't know their language. Neither did the white people know the Auca language. So it was simply that later on we found out the Aucas had just thought, well, these are intruders in our territory. They had had a big discussion after those first 3 had come and had left that evening about whether they should kill these people because they were in their territory. And several said they could be cannibals and they've been cheating, or they've been tricking us this whole time, dropping gifts. And then there were others who said no, but they've been good. And even on the beach to the 3 people, they didn't try to harm them. So they had a big discussion for 2 days. But on Sunday morning, the anger was riled up, and mainly because the young woman who had come to the beach had a boyfriend with her, and the older woman who had come was supposed to be a chaperone. The Aucas had a moral law in their hearts. They believed that a woman should not sleep with a man before he married her. And they also believed that a man can't steal another man's wife. They also believed that lying was wrong and stealing was wrong and that killing was wrong. But the killing, they, of course, had given many excuses for why they had killed people. And so in their own idea of, justifying why people needed to be killed, that was perfectly right to them, anybody that came into their territory. So brutality was probably, of all the Indians in South America, this was the worst of any of the tribes. And that's why 2 women, I said that my father had already learned these phrases from another Auca woman who had fled. Well, 2 women fled after I was 2.5, and they came to some Quichuas, which were within a 3-hour walk of my mother. And a Quichua came and told my mother, ran the trail for 3 hours, saying to my mother, "You've got to come. Some Aucas have come to our area. 2 women have come, and probably all the men are hiding in the trees, and they're going to kill us all." Because the Quichua Indians were not violent people, and they were scared to death of the Aucas. That's why they called them Auca. That's in their language, it meant savage. So these 2 women came. Then my mother gets to know them. She immediately goes down to meet them. She finds out there aren't any Aucas hiding in the trees, and she invites these 2 women to come live with us. They had no plans. They had nothing to do. And the Auca women, of course, are like the whole tribe. They're nomadic, and they are gatherers, hunters and gatherers. So the Auca women made hammocks. They made clay pots. They cooked the food, and they basically stayed right in their village unless they were moving somewhere. So here these 2 women come with no clothing and no plans and no understanding until they found Dayuma, this woman that had told my father some Auca phrases. Dayuma came immediately when she heard these 2 women had come to where the Quichuas lived, and that was probably a long walk for her also. But anyway, these 2 women were invited by my mother through Dayuma's interpretation to come and live with us. And they lived with us almost a year. And during that year, my mother begins to be able to understand and get some of these words that they're using. And it's a completely different language from Quechua. In fact, it's very unique. It doesn't have any relation to any other language in the world. And so my mother is learning this language as these 2 women live with her. And I'm just playing with the little Quechua girl that my mother had a maid. And this maid lived in our house with her little girl. And so I played with her, and somehow these 2 women decide, okay, this woman is good. I mean, they of course saw that my mother was not going to hurt them, and she fed them. And she said, they said, we're going back to our tribe, but we want you to come with us because you know God, and our people should not have killed your husband and the other 4 men. And Dayuma knew the sister of the pilot, Rachel. And Dayuma was told by these 2 women, you need to come back to your home because your family wants you to come back. So if we all go back together, we'll tell our tribe that these women are good and that it was wrong for us to kill those 5 men. And of course, they didn't even have a word for sin or even the word wrong. They had the word badly, which was not doing good. And so they said, we did badly by killing those 5 men. And so there was the opportunity when they said, we're going back, we want you to come. It was the open door for both Rachel and my mother to go and live with the Indians. So when I'm 3.5, we take 3 days to walk from the Quechua village we lived in, Shandia, to where the Aucas lived, which their little village was called Tiwanu. And I'm just a happy-go-lucky kid, and I'm perfectly happy with my mother. And so we just walk with an Indian guide, 2 Indian guides carrying some stuff for us. And we walk into this village and they welcome us. They're hospitable. They're kind. They recognize, because the 2 women had gone ahead to say, these white people that are coming are good and they know about God. So our tribe needs to learn about God. And we did wrong. We did badly, killing those men. So Rachel and my mother and I move in. And we lived there. My mother and I lived there for a little over 2 years. My mother started first grade when I was 5 years old teaching me. And Rachel and she worked on the language together. At the end of the 2 years, my mother decides that we need to go back to live with the Quechuas. It was difficult for Rachel and my mother to agree on how the language should be written down and translated. So my mother decided, since Rachel said, these are my people, I'm going to stay with them the rest of my life. My mother decided that the Quechuas still needed her as a missionary, so she and I moved back to live with the Quechuas. But it truly was a gift from God that we were welcomed. We were happy. My mother and I lived in a hut with no walls, on a mud floor, thatched roof, and that's the way they lived. She slept in a hammock. I slept on a bamboo bed. I was perfectly content and happy to learn the language, play with these kids. I'm only 3.5. Remember, when you're that young, wherever your parents take you, you accept it. There wasn't any difficulty in changing from living with the Quechuas to living with the Aucas. I was just a happy-go-lucky, playful kid. So it was amazing how kind they were to us. And when they recognized that they should not have killed the 5 men, they were very humble about it. Just saying, we want to learn about God, as these 2 women had told them. You need to learn about God. We need to learn. And, they believed that God was their creator. They did not know anything about God. They just knew there was a creator. And the only thing they did anything about as a, quote, religion, where there were evil spirits living in the jungle, is what they told their children and each other, that if you were to go out at night, evil spirits could get you. But they didn't actually do anything to appease the evil spirits. So they had no religion, except we know there's a God. They didn't do anything about it. So it was all new and good news to them that God had sent his son to help take away their badly behavior. And they had to learn what sin meant. And Dayuma, who was the main interpreter, of course, because she had learned Quechua as well as knew her own language, was the one who began to tell the stories of Jesus through my mother and Rachel, helping her understand the stories. And Rachel had basically led her to the Lord. And so every Sunday morning, we'd try to have a little service, and that's in big quotation marks, because Aucas don't normally sit for a service. Nobody sits and tells them anything. So people would be talking. There was no understanding of, you need to be quiet and listen. Children and the adults would all be sitting there on logs. And sometimes the adults were pulling lice out of the children's hair and chatting, while Dayuma would be telling the story of Jesus. But they all seemed to accept the truth of the gospel. It was an unusual thing, because we know most tribes are going to fight against it. They're going to argue. They're going to hate the people who bring this quote unquote good news. But the Lord had prepared their hearts. And they became, as I said, there were only 40 people in this little group. And so it seemed that they all became believers. My mother would never say, we saved a certain number of souls. She didn't like that phrasing, because she said, it is God who is in the business of saving. So whatever understanding he gave to these people, it seemed that they had been prepared to receive it. But there wasn't any huge argument over hearing about who Jesus was and what Jesus did for us. So they said, now we want to follow his trail. will follow his markings. They didn't read, of course. And many of those same Indians that I grew up with and knew even later, when I was 11, we went back. And when I was 45, we went back to see these same Indians. And they never wanted to learn to read. Now, of course, now that the Ecuadorian government has become much more involved in the Indian tribes that are in the Amazon, they have set up schools, Ecuadorian schools, for these Indians to come to. So there's been a lot more bad influence, actually, from the teachers that come and set up these schools. And so I can definitely say there are still many Auca Christians, but as far as the number of Aucas at that time, they think there were about 700, or approximately around 3,000 to 7,000 now. And there are still other tribes that are hostile in the Amazon jungle.
Yeah.
So it's been very challenging for anybody to go into any other of the tribes, though this group of Aucas, as I said, accepted the truth of Christianity.
Sure. Wow. Now, when did you move back to the States? I know, you grew up in Ecuador, but when did you make that transition back, and what was that like after growing up,
Yeah, well, my mother was teaching me first, second, and third grade. When we moved back to live with the Quichuas, it was, I think, the second half of second grade and third grade year. She could tell that because I was the only student and the Quichua Indians didn't have a school going except what my father had started, but then when he left, my mother couldn't continue being the only one teaching everybody. So she mainly worked with the women. In fact, I want to make sure I say this because I forget sometimes. When my father was going to get on the plane to go with Nate to Palm Beach, as he was very excited. Of course, this had been his dream and desire to go meet the Aucas. My mother said to him, "What will I do if you don't come back?" Yeah. And he said, "Teach the believers, darling. Teach the believers." And that's exactly what she continued to do. After she'd gone to live for 2 years with the Aucas, then she believed she still had a responsibility to those Quichuas because there was no other missionary with them. So she was mainly teaching literacy to the women. My father and Pete had taught literacy to the men, but then she also had to continue teaching the men what the Bible taught.
Yeah.
And so she's teaching me in my little homeschool room, and she recognizes, because I really want to be outside playing with kids,
Right,
that I don't care whether I get A's or F's. In my little schooling, she had a correspondence course called Calvert, which she sent my work back to the States every month or every week. I don't know which, but anyway, she was a great teacher, and she taught me how to read very well. And she taught me to appreciate quite a few things as a little first, second, and third grader, but I really didn't want to work very hard at getting great grades. So she decided I needed an American public education. So we moved back when I was 8.5. And I started fourth grade in Franconia, New Hampshire.
Wow.
And we moved there because that's where her family had always gone for summers. It's a beautiful spot in northern New Hampshire among the mountains. And she had a house built, and we lived there for 6.5 years. And I went to public school. And the transition and adjustment was not really that difficult. Number one, in my personality, I like change and adventure and new and different things. And number two, I was too young to really be tremendously affected or upset by the move. My mother had found 2 girls before we started school that fall that I could play with. And so those 2 girls were my best friends. And when I got into school, I immediately sat next to them in school. And I only remember a couple of times raising my 2 fingers, which was the sign to go to the bathroom, to want to just go in the bathroom and be by myself and cry. Now, I don't know that I spent much time crying. I just remember that I just kind of was a little nervous, and this whole new world was so different. And yet it wasn't a huge, hard adjustment for me. As I said, I like change. So I knew my mother's love. My mother had taught me well how much the Lord loved us. Yeah. I trusted her word. She spoke the truth all the time to me. She never used vain words with me. So I grew up really happy, confident, trusting in this God that she told me of, and believing in her love for me. So it was really not that hard of a transition. And of course, a whole new geographical spot on this earth made me appreciate what God had made in the jungle as well as up there.
Wow. That's awesome. Okay. So this year you released a book called Devotedly, Personal Letters and Love Story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot.
Yes.
So tell me about the process of writing that book. I just have to say it is the most beautiful work. I have it on my coffee table. I sometimes bring it back in my office, and I'll just kind of, when I have time, I've been slowly reading through it, and it's just so beautiful. So tell us a little bit about that.
My mother had given me my father's letters back in the 80s when I had 8 children at home. My husband's a pastor. He just retired last year. So we were involved in a church in California, Southern California, when she gave me these letters, and she said, Val, you don't have time to read these now, but put them away in a safe place. Someday you'll want to read them. But she also told me that her letters had all been destroyed. Well, that was a really sad thing, because once in 2011, I started looking for these letters because my youngest daughter was in her last year of high school. And several people had asked me if I knew where my father and mother's love letters were. Well, then I vaguely remembered not only had she given me his letters, but she had also said, he destroyed all of my letters. They're gone. And when I found them in 2011, I was thrilled, of course, to find them in a trunk that I had saved them in. But as I started reading them, I thought, oh my goodness, I have my mother's journals from those same years. So maybe I could put together a book with his letters and her journal entries. Because sometimes, very briefly, she would mention that she got a letter from Jim. Well, the more I tried to do that, and I really started in late 2012, I first wanted to read the journals of Jim Elliot again. I read Through Gates of Splendor, my mother's books that she had published. I read These Strange Ashes. I read Shadow of the Almighty, which is my father's biography. And the more I read, and then the more, when I finished my father's letters, the more I thought, these letters are so beautiful and so profound in truth, spiritual truth, that they need to be published. So I began working on trying to figure out how to do my mother's journal entries as well as my father's. Well, in 2015, my mother died, and I was going through the attic of her possessions in 2016, and I found the Ecuador trunk and took everything out of the Ecuador trunk, and at the very bottom was a little packet of letters to Jim Elliot from my mother. And it was tied with a blue ribbon, the old-fashioned way of putting love letters together. And they're beautifully kept in order. And they've been there ever since she left Ecuador. And I cannot get over that they were never damaged, because the moisture in Ecuador is unbelievable throughout throughout dry and wet season. And they must have kept them in plastic bags, because they wrote with that ink, with a fountain pen. So ink would easily get blurred if it got wet. And there's only one page out of all the letters, one page of my mother's, I believe, that was blurred, and everything else was completely, perfectly legible. My mother's writing was beautiful penmanship, and my father's writing was also beautiful penmanship. But what they wrote was so wonderful and spiritually deep that I felt like, okay, now I've got my mother's letters. Well, what I discovered then is the first year of their writing, I had his letters, but for some reason I didn't have hers. And so I figured, well, those must have been the letters that my mother thought he had destroyed. Well, I put the book together. It took almost 5 years, just figuring out, I really didn't want to say much at all. I just wanted to publish them, period. Put all the letters together, and the letters told the story. But the publisher, Lifeway, asked me to give comments, and the editor had questions for me that I hadn't even thought to write about. So that helped me. He was a tremendous help. His name is Lawrence Kimbrough, and I want to give him honor and appreciation, because I could not have put this book together without his help, as well as 2 very dear friends who were good readers and writers. So everything got put together it was done by December, and it was published February the 1st this past year by Lifeway. Well, amazing new news is that these letters of the first year of their correspondence have now been found.
My goodness, so awesome.
So I am hoping, don't know for sure yet, but I'm hoping that I will be able to publish just a small book of her letters in that first year. So,
oh, that's so exciting. I can't wait to get that in my hand. Devotedly, what's it called when you add like a
a prequel or a sequel.
Yes,
so this will be a sequel
yes,
because
yes,
even
yes.
though it's the first year of their writing, it's not exactly the end of their writing. They, of course, ended when they got married. But it's very exciting what the Lord has provided. And, of course, it was to me a miracle to even find the first packet of letters, which are most of the 5 years, just not the first 8 or 9 months. So
Sure.
God is
That's
good.
so awesome.
Yes.
He is so good.